Hashtag Chapter 1. The taxonomist's exile Alistair Stone had been living in the woods for 7 years, 3 months, and he consulted the hash marks carved into his workbench 18 days when he first noticed that his chickens had grown a second set of eyes. Not that anyone was counting. Certainly not Alistair, who had fled Minneapolis after what the newspapers had diplomatically called the incident at the Walker Art Center, and what Alistair privately thought of as the greatest misunderstanding in the history of Western jurisprudence. The Rothko had been asterisk, right there asterisk, practically asking to be saved from that insipid fundraiser, crowd clutching their Chardonnay like life preservers. How was he supposed to know the museum had installed weight sensors under the paintings? The chickens were watching him now, with all 4 eyes per bird, their heads cocking at mathematically improbable angles as he scattered feed across the coop. Alistair had stopped questioning these things around year 3. First it had been the rabbits developing a taste for tobacco they'd nibble, the cigarette butts he tossed into the compost heap, then sit in small contemplative circles like war veterans at a VFW hall. Then the deer started appearing in perfect geometric formations, arranging themselves in his clearing at dawn, in what looked disturbingly like occult symbols. Alistair had looked them up, once in an old book of esoterica. They were... "You've been practicing again," he told the nearest chicken, which blinked all 4 eyes in sequence like a feathered traffic light. "We talked about this." His woodshop occupied what had once been a root cellar attached to the Cabernet previous owner's project, abandoned when the structural integrity of the hillside had apparently been called into question. Alistair had reinforced it himself, installed proper ventilation, and spent most of his waking hours there, crafting furniture that no one would ever buy because no one knew he existed, and that was precisely how he preferred it. The shop smelled of cedar shavings and machine oil, with grace notes of the mildew that persistently colonized the northeastern corner, no matter how many times he bleached it into submission. His projects hung on the walls in various states of completion. A rocking chair that rocked in figure eights, a bookshelf designed to accommodate books that didn't technically exist yet, he'd done the math, and a dining table with a hollow interior where he stored his more problematic possessions, a box of 64 Crayola crayons, for instance, which he'd been informed by a very stern federal prosecutor were material evidence and should have been surrendered. The crayons had nothing to do with the Rothko. They were from a completely separate incident involving his ex-wife, a meditation retreat in Sedona, and what she'd called his pathological inability to take anything seriously. She'd thrown them at his head during the final argument, and he'd kept them out of spite. Now they remained in the table's hidden compartment, along with some cash, his old university ID, and a paperback copy of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales that had belonged to his grandmother. He'd been reading The Snow Queen that morning, in fact, which perhaps explained why he was thinking about Inge. Inge Sorensen appeared in his clearing approximately twice a month, always at dusk, always wearing the same tattered peacoat despite the season, and always carrying something inexplicable. Last time, it had been a jar of what she claimed were pickled prophecies. The time before that, a broken metronome that still somehow kept time, just not asterisk this asterisk time, if you understood what she meant. Alistair never understood what she meant. She was the only other human being within 400 miles of anything resembling civilization, having staked her claim to an even more remote section of the forest, some 15 miles northwest. Alistair had encountered her the first week after his arrival, when he'd been naive enough to think he might need to warn her about his presence. She'd laughed at him a sound like wind chimes made of bone and told him he was exactly where he needed to be, whether he knew it or not. "You're a taxonomist," she'd said, though he'd never mentioned his previous career organizing specimen collections at the University Museum. You understand categories, boundaries, what happens when things don't fit. She'd been right, of course, which was the most unsettling part. Alistair had been a taxonomist, specializing in the classification of evolutionary anomaly species that didn't quite slot into their expected branches of the tree of life. He'd lost that position around the same time as the Rothko incident, though technically for different reasons involving allegations of academic fraud. The fraud being that he'd suggested, in a peer-reviewed journal, that perhaps the reason some specimens were impossible to classify was because they were refusing asterisks to be classified, which was apparently not how science worked. The specimens had been placed in storage. Alistair had been placed on administrative leave. The Rothko had been placed back on the wall of the walker, though with noticeably tighter security. Now he classified wood grain and animal behavior, which was somehow both more predictable and more bizarre than anything he'd encountered in academia. He was planing a piece of white oak destined to become the leg of an end table that would probably never end up next to anything when the temperature in the workshop dropped 15 degrees in as many seconds. His breath emerged in clouds. The light bulb overhead flickered and dimmed to the color of old honey. Alistair set down the plane very carefully. This was new. The chickens outside had gone silent. Not the natural silence of birds settling for the evening, but the aggressive silence of prey animals that had spotted a predator. The kind of silence that had evolutionary weight behind it, millions of years of asterisk shut up, or die asterisk compressed into the absence of sound. He turned slowly, because sudden movement seemed inadvisable, and that's when he saw it. The northeastern corner his perpetually mildewed northeastern corner had changed. Where there had been stained concrete and the ghost of water damage, there was now a gap. Not a crack or a hole, but a genuine absence of wall, as if reality had simply decided it had better things to do than maintain structural integrity in that specific location. Beyond the gap, he could see stairs. They descended into darkness, old stone steps worn smooth by passage, lit by nothing he could identify as a light source, but somehow visible nonetheless. Cool air wafted up, carrying the smell of minerals and something else, something that reminded him unsettlingly of the museum back in Minneapolis, that particular combination of old things and careful preservation. Alistair stood there for what might have been 30 seconds or 30 minutes. Time had gotten slippery, the way it did when you were witnessing something that your brain absolutely refused to file under any existing category. Well, he said finally, to no one in particular, that's architecturally unsound. From somewhere in the distance, or perhaps somewhere very close, but simply not in the same here as he heard what might have been laughter. It sounded remarkably like wind chimes made of bone. Alistair picked up a flashlight, tested it twice, and approached the gap. The rational part of his brain, the part that had earned a doctorate and published in peer-reviewed journals, as screaming that this was clearly a psychological break, possibly brought on by 7 years of isolation and talking to increasingly aberrant poultry. The rest of his brain, the larger and more honest part, knew that he'd been waiting for something exactly like this since the day he'd arrived. He'd been a taxonomist. He understood boundaries. And he understood that every boundary, eventually, was just an invitation to discover what lay on the other side. The stairs were solid under his feet. That was either reassuring or damning. He hadn't decided which. He descended 3 steps, then 5, the workshop receding above him into what seemed like much greater distance than geometry should have allowed. At the 7th step, he paused. There was something carved into the stone wall beside him, worn almost smooth, but still legible if you knew how to look at things that didn't want to be seen. He'd gotten very good at that over the past 7 years. It was a symbol. The same symbol the deer had been making in his clearing that morning. "Of course," Alistair muttered, and continued down into the dark, the flashlight beam swallowing and being swallowed in equal measure. Behind him, in the workshop, the Crayola box in the hidden table compartment began to hum. Just softly. Just enough. And in her cabin 15 miles northwest, Inge Sorensen set down her teacup, smiled her terrible smile, and said to the darkness, "Right on schedule." The chickens, all 8 eyes per bird now, settled down to roost. Some boundaries, they knew, were meant to be crossed. Others were meant to cross **U**. It was going to be an interesting season. Chapter 2. The summons of Inge Alistair made it down exactly 43 steps before the stairs simply weren't there anymore. One moment his boot was landing on worn stone, the next it was pressing into something that felt distressingly organic, spongy and warm and *breathing*. He jerked his foot back, the flashlight beam caroming wildly across what was no longer a stairwell, but rather a tunnel, or possibly a throat. With walls that glistened wetly in the light and seemed to contract in a rhythm that Alistair's taxonomist brain unhelpfully identified as peristaltic. "No," he said firmly to the universe at large. "Absolutely not." The universe, in a move that would characterize most of their relationship going forward, ignored him entirely. The tunnel contracted. Alistair stumbled forward, not because he chose to, but because the walls behind him had decided he'd been lingering too long. The flashlight flew from his grip, clattered once against something that shouldn't have bones but definitely did, and went dark. Total darkness swallowed him, the kind of primordial black that predated the concept of light, that made you understand on a cellular level why your ancestors had been afraid of caves. Then he was moving. Not walking, not falling, but being transported in a way that suggested the tunnel had opinions about his destination and a limited tolerance for his pace. He felt himself squeezed, rotated, possibly turned inside out at least once, though he was fairly certain his organs remained in their factory standard positions, and ejected with the same enthusiasm as a watermelon seed between thumb and forefinger. He landed on grass. Real grass, cold with evening dew, under a sky full of stars that were all in the wrong positions. Alistair lay there for a moment, taking inventory. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, dignity absolutely demolished. The ground was solid. That was something. He could hear wind in trees, smell wood smoke, and something cooking, something that smelled of roasted meat and vegetables, but also of mathematics and old promises. He sat up slowly and immediately wished he hadn't. He was in a clearing, but not any clearing he recognized. Inge's property, he realized with a sinking feeling, though he'd only visited once before, and that had been during daylight and while in possession of his full faculties. Around him, emerging from the tree line with the inevitability of a nightmare or a tax audit, came the inhabitants. The first one appeared to be a Brussels sprout. Not a person dressed as a Brussels sprout, not a Brussels sprout costume, but an actual Brussels sprout approximately 4 feet tall, ambulatory, and carrying what looked very much like a backgammon board. "Oh good," Alistair said to no one in particular, because at this point who was he even talking to? Vegetables. The Brussels sprout approached with a rolling gait, set down the backgammon board with surprising delicacy, and opened it. The board was carved from wood that seemed to eat light, the points inlaid with what might have been mother-of-pearl or possibly compressed screaming. The sprout produced dice-normal dice, which was somehow more unsettling than if they'd been made of teeth or prayer, beads and rolled them. Double sixes. I don't know how to play backgammon, Alistair offered weakly. The Brussels sprout pointed one leafy appendage at him, then at the board, then made a gesture that transcended language to communicate the universal concept of asterisk, sit down and play, or else asterisk. Alistair sat down. He had no idea what or else meant in this context and possessed insufficient courage to find out. The game began. Alistair moved pieces at random, operating on the principle that if you looked confident enough, people or sentient vegetables would assume you knew what you were doing. The Brussels sprout played with the focused intensity of a chess grandmaster or a particularly gifted serial killer. Every time Alistair captured one of its pieces, the sprout would emit a small sigh that smelled of sulphur and disappointed expectations. Around them, more figures emerged from the forest. A group of what Alistair could only describe as ninnies had no other word for them. They simply radiated ninniness. With their simpering expressions and ridiculous hats, and the way they giggled at everything, while somehow making the sound threatening. They formed a circle around the backgammon game, holding hands, swaying to music, only they could hear. "Free love!" one of them shouted suddenly, apropos of nothing. "Free love!" the others chorused back, and they began to spin, faster and faster, until they blurred into a ring of pastel colours and bad decisions. "I'm having a stroke," Alistair informed the Brussels sprout. "This is a very elaborate stroke." The sprout rolled again. "Snake eyes." It made a clicking sound deep in its cruciferous core that conveyed profound disappointment in Alistair as both an opponent and a person. That's when Alistair noticed the pantaloons. They hung from a tree branch above the circle of spinning ninnies, swaying in a wind that didn't touch anything else. They were old-fashioned pantaloons, the kind that Victorian gentlemen wore, cream-coloured and monogrammed with initials he couldn't quite make out in the starlight. They seemed significant in a way that Alistair's brain absolutely refused to process. "The pantaloons of destiny," a voice whispered next to his ear. Alistair nearly fell over. One of the ninnies had broken from the circle and crouched beside him, still giggling but also somehow managing to look profoundly serious, which created a cognitive dissonance that made Alistair's left eye twitch. "I don't what?" he managed. "She who discards the pantaloons commands the evening," the ninny stage whispered, breath smelling of peppermint and existential dread. "She who retrieves them commands the soul." That doesn't make any sense. Free love. The ninny shrieked directly into his face, then cartwheeled back into the spinning circle. The Brussels sprout made an impatient noise and pointed at the board. Alistair had apparently won, though he had no memory of the moves that had led to this outcome. The sprout stood, bowed with what might have been respect, or might have been a threat. Taxonomically speaking, the line was fuzzy, and rolled away into the darkness, the backgammon board cradled like a beloved child. The ninnies stopped spinning. In perfect unison, they turned to face Alistair. "She's ready for you now," they said in one voice that was somehow worse than their many voices. "Ready for what?" Alistair asked, but they were already parting, creating a path through their circle, and he could see it now. Inge's cabin, which absolutely had not been there 30 seconds ago, but was now manifestly present. Lights glowing warmly in the windows, smoke curling from the chimney in patterns that looked disturbingly like Old Norse runes. Alistair stood on legs that felt borrowed from someone with less developed survival instincts and walked through the gap in the ninny circle. They swayed as he passed, humming something that might have been a hymn, or might have been a threat, or might have been Bath. Alistair had learned long ago that the Venn diagram of those categories overlapped more than most people were comfortable acknowledging. The cabin door opened before he could knock. Warmth and light spilled out, along with that smell of egg and roasted meat, vegetables, and something else. Something that made his taxonomist brain light up with recognition, even though he couldn't quite identify it. The smell of things being categorized. The smell of boundaries being drawn. "Come in, Alistair," Inge's voice called from within. "We have so much to discuss." He stepped through the door into a room that was larger than the cabin exterior could possibly contain. The walls were lined with shelves bearing jars of preserved things, specimens. Some he recognized from his academic days, others that made him certain that his academic days had been woefully incomplete in their scope. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden table, and behind it, in a chair that looked suspiciously like a throne carved from a single piece of black walnut, sat Inge. She looked exactly as she always died, indeterminate age, somewhere between 50 and 500, hair the color of steel wool, eyes that saw too much and forgave too little except. Now she was wearing a crown made of what appeared to be Brussels sprout leaves, woven with strips of pantaloon fabric and backgammon pieces. "You came," she said, and smiled. The smile was not reassuring. "I was brought," Alistair corrected, violently, through what I believe was either a dimensional portal or an extremely aggressive digestive system. Details. She waved a hand dismissively. "Neil, I'm sorry." "What?" "Neil, Alistair, you're in the presence of the forest seneschal, keeper of the taxonomic boundaries, guardian of the discarded pantaloons, and champion of the Brussels sprout territories. A little respect, if you please." Alistair stared at her. "You're insane." "Probably. Neil, anyway." Something in her voice made it clear that this was not a request. Not really. And that the alternative to kneeling would involve finding out what the Brussels sprouts did with backgammon losers. Alistair, who had already played one game too many today, lowered himself to his knees on the rough wooden floor. "Better," Inge said, leaning forward. "Now, let me tell you about the stairs in your workshop, about the world below, and about why you, Alistair Stone, failed taxonomist, thief of modernist paintings, keeper of four-eyed chickens, and the only man foolish enough to classify the unclassifiable are going to help me steal something far more valuable than a Rothko." Alistair knelt there, his knees already aching, and thought about the Hans Christian Andersen book back in his cabin. Specifically, he thought about the Snow Queen, about Gerda kneeling before the Finnish woman who told her that her power was in her innocence. Alistair, who had stolen a painting and committed academic fraud and lived alone in the woods talking to aberrant poultry, had no innocence left. Which meant his power, whatever it was, came from somewhere considerably less reassuring. "I'm listening," he said, because what else was there to say? Inge's smile widened. Outside, the ninnies began to sing about free love and vegetables. The Brussels sprouts prepared their boards for the next game. The pantaloons swayed in their tree, waiting for someone to claim them or discard them, whichever came first. And in Alistair's workshop, 15 miles and several dimensions away, the Crayola box hummed a little louder, and the stairs down to the underground world grew 7 steps deeper. It was going to be a very interesting season indeed. #Chapter 3. The Inquisition of root vegetables. But first, Inge said, snapping her fingers, we need to be certain you can handle what's coming. The door behind Alistair opened with a creak that sounded like breaking promises. He didn't need to turn around to know something terrible was entering the temperature. Drop, and the smell of soil and vindictiveness told him everything he needed to know. Alistair, stone, a voice said, crisp as fresh celery, cold as a root cellar in January. We have questions. He turned, despite himself. The carrot stood roughly 5 feet tall, orange and imperious, with a crown of green fronds that quivered with barely contained authority. Next to it, equally imposing, stood what Alistair's traumatized brain identified as a rutabaga bulbous, purple-white, and radiating the kind of patient malevolence that came from spending months underground in the dark, thinking about grievances. I don't understand what's happening, Alistair said, which was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said in years. You will, the carrot replied, and produced from somewhere behind its tapered body a small wooden box. We're going to play a game. I already played backgammon with the Brussels sprout. This, the rutabaga interjected, its voice like grinding millstones, is not backgammon. The box opened. Inside were cards, hundreds of them, each one covered in tiny, meticulous handwriting. Alistair recognized his own handwriting, his own words. Every doubt he'd ever had, every fear, every moment of shame and regret and self-loathing, transcribed onto cardstock with bureaucratic precision. Where did you get those? His voice came out smaller than he'd intended. You brought them with you, Inge said from her throne. Everyone does. We just made them visible. The carrot selected a card at random. February 14th, 2019. You forgot your mother's birthday. You didn't call. You told yourself you'd do it the next day, but you didn't. She died 3 months later. Read it aloud. No, read it, Alistair. The rutabaga moved closer. It didn't touch him. Didn't need Touette's presence was enough. That sense of ancient, patient displeasure, of roots that went deeper than reason. Alistair, read the card. His voice shook. The words felt like they were being pulled out of him, each syllable a small violence. The carrot selected another card. Then another. Each one a different failure. A different moment of cowardice or selfishness, or simple, human inadequacy. The Rothko theft, yes, but also smaller things the colleague he'd undermined to get published. The ex-wife he'd stopped loving but hadn't told, the dog he'd promised to adopt but never did. Every petty cruelty, every moment of weakness, read aloud in that cabin, while Inge watched with those tune-knowing eyes. The rutabaga spoke only occasionally, asking clarifying questions in that grinding voice. And how did that make you feel? What did you tell yourself to justify it? Do you think she forgave you? Alistair had no idea how long it lasted. Time had become unreliable again, elastic and cruel. His throat was raw. His knees ached. The cards seemed infinite, and he realized with growing horror that they probably were that shame had no bottom, that if you looked at yourself honestly enough, you could find an infinite supply of reasons to hate what you saw. Please, he finally whispered. Please, I can't, one more, the carrot said, selecting a card with deliberate care. This is the important one. Alistair took it with shaking hands. The handwriting was his, but he didn't remember writing it. The words made his vision blur. Asterisk, I deserve to be alone. I deserve the woods and the silence and the chickens with too many eyes. I deserve to be forgotten. I deserve asterisk, no, a voice said. Not Alistair's voice. A smaller voice, younger somehow, speaking with the confidence of something that had never learned doubt. The cabin door burst open, not the one Alistair had entered through, but a different door, one that led to somewhere else entirely. Through it tumbled a cascade of colour, 64 crayons, bright and impossible, rolling across the floor with purpose. The Crayolas, Inge breathed, standing from her throne. How? The crayons began to draw. On the floor, on the walls, on the air itself, sketching in colours that didn't exist on any colour wheel Alistair had ever seen. They drew his cabin, his workshop, his life in the woods. They drew it with love, with the kind of unself-conscious affection that only a child or a box of crayons could manage. They drew him as he actually was, flawed and exiled and yes, alone, but also surviving. Also making furniture that no one would buy, but that he made anyway. Also feeding chickens that shouldn't exist, but did. Also living, against all odds and reason, in a world that kept getting stranger and refusing to give up. The vegetables recoiled. The cards scattered, words blurring and running like watercolours in rain. Alistair, the crayons seemed to say, though they had no voices, only colours. Wake up. And he did. He was standing in his workshop, had been standing there for he checked his watch 4 hours. His legs were screaming. His hand was pressed against the northeastern corner wall, palm flat against the cold, mildewed concrete. There was no gap, no stairs, no underground world. Just him, alone in his workshop, with a splitting headache and a mouth that tasted of soil and something bitter, something medicinal. The Crayola box sat on his workbench, open. The crayons were scattered across the surface, as if they'd been thrown there in a hurry, or as if they'd thrown themselves. Alistair stumbled to the box, found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the tray. He opened it with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. The handwriting was unfamiliar, spidery and old. Asterisk the tea I brought you last week. Did you enjoy it? The mushrooms grow only on the north side of dead oaks. Very special. Very useful for opening doors. Or for making people think doors have opened. Same difference, really. I.S. the tea. He'd drunk it 3 days ago, hadn't thought anything of it when Inge had stopped by with her usual strange gifts. She'd insisted he drink it while she watched, said it would help with the headaches he'd been having. He hadn't been having headaches. Not until after the tea. Alistair ran. Out of the workshop, across his clearing, into the woods. 15 miles northwest, his legs protesting every step, his lungs burning. He didn't know if he was running toward something or away from it toward confrontation or toward answers, but he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't stay in his cabin and pretend this hadn't happened. The sun was setting by the time he reached Inge's property. The real property, not the nightmare version. Her cabin sat in its clearing, smoke rising from the chimney, looking entirely too normal. Too innocent. Inge was sitting on her porch, rocking in a chair he'd never seen before, drinking something from a chipped mug. She smiled when she saw him. Alistair, I wondered when you'd arrive. He stopped at the edge of her clearing, breath ragged, anger and fear warring in his chest. What did you do to me? What needed to be done? She took a sip from her mug. You've been circling the truth for 7 years, Alistair. Living in the woods, talking to your chickens, pretending you chose this exile. Someone had to push you off the fence. You drugged me, You tortured me. I showed you what you show yourself every night before you sleep." She set down her mug. "The only difference is I made you look at it all at once, and I showed you what happens when you stop looking away. The crayons saved you. Yes, that's what they do. That's what they've always done." She stood slowly, moved to the porch railing. "Your ex-wife threw them at your head because you wouldn't take anything seriously, wouldn't face anything real. And you kept them because somewhere deep down, you knew they were more than just crayons. They were the last piece of you that still believed in color, in creation, in making something just because it should exist." Alistair stood there, every muscle trembling. "You had no right. I had every right. The stairs in your workshop are real, Alistair. The underground world is real. The things that need classifying down there are real. But you can't face them if you can't even face yourself." She moved down the porch steps, and for the first time, Alistair noticed she looked tired. Old. Actually old, not the ageless strain she usually projected. "There are things down there that need a taxonomist," she continued. "Things that have been waiting for someone who understands boundaries, who knows how to look at the impossible and give it a name. But it will show you things worse than vegetables, with cards. It will show you things that will break you if you're already broken." "So you broke me first? Is that your logic?" "No." She stood before him now, close enough that he could see the lines around her eyes, the genuine concern beneath the strangeness. "I showed you that you can break, that the Crayolas, that silly, childish box of colors can save you when you can't save yourself. That you're not as alone as you think you are." Alistair wanted to hit her, wanted to run, wanted to scream. Instead, he said, "I could leave. I could pack up and be gone by morning." "You could," Inge agreed, "but you won't. Because now you know the stairs are real, and you know something is down there, and you're a taxonomist, Alistair. You can't not look. It's not in your nature." She was right. He hated that she was right. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I go down there, no more drugging. No more games. The truth. All of it." "The truth," Inge promised. "Though I should warn you it's considerably stranger than the lies." They stood there in the failing light, two exiles at the edge of the world, staring at each other across a gulf of trust that had been shattered and would need to be rebuilt from scratch. The forest around them was silent, watching, waiting to see what these two strange humans would decide. Finally, Alistair nodded. "Tomorrow. We start tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Inge agreed. He turned to leave, made it 3 steps before he stopped. "Why me? Really?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Because 7 years ago, when you first arrived, you classified my chickens as Gallus domesticus with ocular multiplicity syndrome. You didn't call them monsters. You didn't call them impossible. You gave them a name. You made them real." She smiled, and for once it wasn't terrible. "That's a gift, Alistair. Down in the dark, we're going to need someone who can make the impossible real." Alistair walked back through the forest alone, the stars overhead in their wrong positions, the crayons in his pocket humming softly. Tomorrow, he would descend the stairs. Tomorrow, he would face the underground world. But tonight, he would sleep in his cabin, surrounded by his impossible animals, and dream of color. Alistair's legs gave out halfway back to Inge's porch. He caught himself on the railing, breathing hard, the adrenaline that had carried him 15 miles through the forest finally depleting itself like a battery running dry. "Come inside," Inge said, already moving toward the door. "You're exhausted." You can stay here tonight, it's too far back to your place in this state. Every instinct Alistair possessed screamed at him to refuse, to stagger back to his cabin no matter how long it took. But his body had other ideas, his knees were buckling. His vision kept narrowing to a tunnel. When had he last eaten? This morning, yesterday. Just for a few hours, he heard himself say. Then I'm leaving. Of course. She held the door open, and he stumbled through. The interior was nothing like the nightmare cabin. It was small, cluttered in the way of people who lived alone and stopped caring what things looked like. Bookshelves sagging under the weight of ancient paperbacks, a wood stove radiating heat. Mismatched furniture that looked salvaged from different decades. The jars were still there, rows of them on shelves, but in the normal light they contained normal things. Pickles, preserves, dried herbs. Not specimens. Not impossibilities. Sit, Inge commanded, gesturing at the kitchen table. I'll make up the spare room. Alistair sat, because sitting was easier than standing. The kitchen was warm, almost oppressively so. He could hear Inge moving around in the back of the cabin, the creak of old floorboards. The rustle of linens being pulled from storage. He let his eyes wander across the room, not looking for anything in particular. Just letting his taxonomist's brain catalogue and categorize the way it always did when confronted with new environments. Copper pots hanging from hooks. A calendar from 2023, never updated. A coffee mug with a faded logo. He squinted at it from the Walker Art Centre. Alistair froze. The mug. Why would Inge have a mug from the Walker Art Centre? She'd been living out here for decades, or so she claimed. The Walker hadn't even started their merchandise program until the mid-2000s, and that particular logo, that specific design, had only been used for 1 year. 2019. The year he'd stolen the Rothko. #R-penned by the cold finger of dread tracing his spine. On the counter, partially hidden behind a flour canister, a newspaper clipping, he stood on shaking legs, moved closer. The headline was about him. Former university taxonomist sought in Walker art theft. His photo. His name. The clipping was yellowed, but tucked into a frame, preserved deliberately. On the wall near the door, almost hidden behind a coat rack, a map. His property was marked with a red X. His cabin, his workshop, his chicken coop, everything labelled in meticulous detail. Arrival date noted, September 3, 2018. That was wrong. He'd arrived September 7th. He was certain of it. Except he'd lost those first few days, hadn't he? The drive out had been long, and he'd been so tired. And there had been that helpful old woman at the gas station who'd given him coffee and directions, and oh God, the helpful old woman. Marcus turned slowly. Inge stood in the doorway to the back room, no longer looking tired. Looking, in fact, perfectly alert. In her hand was a syringe. You were supposed to sleep, she said, almost sadly. The tea from 3 days ago should have made you more suggestible. The exertion of running here should have exhausted you. You were supposed to sleep, and then tomorrow we'd begin the real work. There is no underground world, Marcus said, his voice distant even to his own ears. There never was. Oh, Marcus. She took a step into the kitchen. Did you really think your chickens grew extra eyes on their own? That deer arranged themselves in occult patterns for fun. That Brussels sprouts play backgammon. You've been drugging me for 7 years. Conditioning you, she corrected. Small doses in the gifts I brought. Mushroom tea. Spores in the pickled prophecies. Creating a baseline of unreality so that when I needed you to see something, really see it, your brain would already be primed to accept the impossible. Marcus's hand found the edge of the kitchen table, gripped it hard enough to hurt. Why? Because I needed a taxonomist. Because something is coming. Marcus. Something that needs to be classified and named and made real. And you're the only person I know who's desperate enough and broken enough and brilliant enough to do it. But you had to be ready. You had to believe. Believe in what? You're insane in yourself, she interrupted. In your ability to see what others can't. To name what has no name. The underground world is real, Marcus. Just not the way you experienced it. Not yet. But it will be, with your help. She moved closer. Marcus stumbled backward, his hip connecting with the counter. His hand scrabbled behind him. Found a drawer handle, yanked it open. Kitchen utensils clattered. His fingers closed around something cold and metal. He pulled out the gun before his conscious mind even registered what he was doing. Inge stopped. Marcus, stay back. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep it pointed at her. Stay the fuck back. You don't want to, I don't want to shoot you. You're right about that. What I want is to leave. What I want is to go back to my cabin and pack my things and drive as far away from here as possible and never think about any of this again. You can't drive, Inge said quietly. Your truck's been at my property for 3 months. I told you it needed repairs. You've been using my ATV to get to town. Don't you remember? He didn't remember. Of course he didn't remember. How much of the last 7 years was real? How much was her chemicals and his wishful thinking and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, his exile meant something? Then you're going to drive me, he said. Right now. Get your keys. Marcus, please. He pulled back the hammer. He didn't know if it was already loaded. Didn't know if the safety was on. Didn't know anything except that he needed to hear that click. Needed her to understand that he was serious. Keys. Now. Inge's face did something complicated: regret, frustration, resignation, and something else. Something that might have been respect. She moved slowly to a hook by the door, retrieved a key ring. The truck's out front. Move. They walked out into the night. Marcus keeping the gun trained on her back, even though everything in him was screaming that this was wrong, that he was the villain in this scene. That she was an old woman, and he was threatening her with a weapon, and nothing about this fit into any category his taxonomist brain knew how to classify. But what else was he supposed to do? Her truck was old, rusted, held together by spite and duct tape. She climbed into the driver's seat. He got in the passenger side, gun still pointed at her. Trying to remember how this worked in movies. Don't sit too close. Keep the weapon steady. Don't let her see how terrified you are. Marcus, she said, as she started the engine, when we get to your cabin, you need to go inside and look at something. In your workshop, please. Just drive. I'm serious. Look at the northeastern corner. Really look at it. Not the wall. The floor. The cracks in the concrete. I swear to you, Marcus, I swear on whatever you still believe is real, just look. Drive. She drove. The 15 miles took an eternity, the headlights carving tunnels through the darkness. The forest pressing in on both sides like it was trying to swallow them. Marcus kept the gun steady and tried not to think about what he was going to do when they arrived. Pack a bag? Take what little money he had. Drive to where? Civilization? Turn himself in? Explain to the authorities that he'd been living in the woods for 7 years under the influence of hallucinogens administered by a crazy old woman who thought vegetables could play backgammon. They'd lock him up. Or worse, they'd send him back to Minneapolis for the Rothko trial. He'd go to prison. The truck stopped. They were in his clearing. His cabin stood dark and silent. The workshop beside it. The chicken coop beyond that. Everything exactly as he'd left it hours ago, when the world had still made a kind of sense. "We're here," Inge said quietly. "You can take the truck. The keys. Everything. I won't stop you. But please, Marcus, before you go look at the floor in your workshop, just look. Get out," he said. They both got out. The night air was cold, crystalline with the kind of clarity that came after rain, even though it hadn't rained. Marcus kept the gun trained on her as they walked to the workshop door. He fumbled with the lock one-handed, finally got it open. The workshop was exactly as he'd left it, the Crayola box still open on the workbench, the crayons scattered, his projects hanging on the walls, the northeastern corner with its mildewed concrete, and Marcus stopped. The concrete was cracked. Had it always been cracked? Yes, of course it had. That was one of the issues with the previous owner's construction. But these cracks, they formed a pattern, a specific pattern. He'd seen it before, in academic texts, in journal articles about archaeological finds in places that predated known civilization. The cracks formed letters, not English letters, not any alphabet he could name, but letters nonetheless, and as he stared at them, as his taxonomist brain finally categorized what it was seeing, he realized with a cold certainty that these hadn't been here 7 years ago. These were new. Or rather, these were asterisk becoming asterisk. "You see it now," Inge said from the doorway. She didn't sound triumphant. She sounded tired. "The chemicals I gave you didn't create anything, Marcus. They just helped you see what was already there. What's been trying to break through for 7 years? What's been waiting for someone to name it?" Marcus turned to face her, the gun suddenly feeling very heavy in his hand. "What is it?" "I don't know. That's why I need you." She took a step inside, and he didn't stop her. "I can see that something is coming. Something that exists between categories. Something that needs a taxonomist to give it shape and form and reality. But I can't do it alone. I'm not trained for this. You are. The vegetables were real and not real. Thought forms, maybe. Projections. Things that exist in the space where your mind and the underground meet." She moved closer to the floor, knelt down, traced one of the cracks with a finger. "It's like a language, Marcus. It's trying to speak. And someone needs to answer." Marcus stood there, gun hanging limply at his side, staring at the pattern in the concrete. His chickens were silent in their coo. The forest beyond was silent. Even the wind had stopped, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide. Finally, he set the gun down on the workbench. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I help you with whatever this is, no more lies, no more drugs, no more manipulation. We do this as partners, or we don't do it at all." Inge looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked almost human. "Partners," she agreed. "And you tell me everything. Starting with why you have a mug from the Walker Art Center." She smiled, just a little. "I used to work there." security guard, night shift. I was the one who discovered the Rothko was missing. She stood, brushed dust from her knees. I was the one who saw you on the cameras. And I was the one who erased the footage of you arriving in the loading dock because I saw something in your face that night, Marcus. Something I recognized. What? Desperation, she said simply. The kind of desperation that comes from knowing the world is bigger and stranger than anyone admits and being punished for seeing it. So I let you escape. And then I spent 7 years finding you, living near you, preparing you for the moment when the world would crack open and need someone brave enough or crazy enough to look inside. Marcus wanted to be angry, wanted to feel betrayed. But standing in his workshop, looking at letters from an alphabet that didn't exist forming in the concrete floor, he mostly just felt tired. The stairs, he said. Are they real? Tomorrow? Inge promised. Tomorrow we'll find out together. She left then, driving away in her truck, leaving Marcus alone with his chickens and his crayons and the pattern in the floor that was growing more complex by the hour. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his workshop with a notebook and a flashlight, copying the letters, trying to understand their structure, their grammar, their meaning. The Crayolas sat on the workbench beside him, and occasionally he couldn't be sure, but occasionally he thought he saw them move, just slightly, drawing invisible lines in the air that matched the cracks in the floor. By dawn, he had filled 6 pages with notes and 3 pages with sketches, and 1 page with a single question written over and over. Asterisk, what happens when we name something that doesn't want to be named? Asterisk, the sun rose. The chickens began to stir, blinking all 4 eyes, and yes, they definitely had 4 eyes. He could see that clearly now. The forest beyond his clearing rustled with the movement of deer, who were probably arranging themselves into some new configuration. And in the northeastern corner of his workshop, where the mildew had always been worst, a small crack in the concrete widened, just slightly. Just enough. Tomorrow, Marcus thought. Tomorrow, we go down. But for now. He made coffee and fed the chickens and tried to remember what it felt like to be a person who lived in a world where vegetables didn't play backgammon and old women didn't drug you for 7 years and paintings stayed on museum walls where they belonged. He couldn't remember. The world had always been stranger than that. He'd just been too scared to admit it. Not anymore. Chapter 5. The birth and the leaving Inge's truck rattled back into the clearing at 7:47 a.m. Marcus knew the exact time because he'd been staring at his watch every 3 minutes since dawn. Waiting, wondering if she'd actually come back, or if their partnership had been another manipulation, another layer of the elaborate unreality she'd constructed. She climbed out of the truck slowly, moving like someone 20 years older than she'd seemed the night before. Her face was pale, slicked with sweat, despite the morning chill. Are you all right? Marcus called from the workshop doorway. No, she said, and then her knees buckled. He ran to her, caught her before she hit the ground. She was burning up, her skin fever hot through her coat. Her eyes rolled back, showing whites that were threaded with red. Inge? Inge? What's happening? Not, she gasped. Not what I planned. And then she screamed. It was a sound Marcus had never heard from a human throat, high and keening and primal. She doubled over in his arms, her hands clutching her abdomen, and he saw impossible. His brain supplied uselessly, taxonomically impossible, saw her stomach distend, bulge, move with something that was definitely not supposed to be there. Oh God, Marcus breathed. "Oh God, get me inside," she managed between gasps. He half carried, half dragged her into the cabin. She was impossibly heavy, as if she'd gained 100 pounds in the 30 seconds since he'd caught her. He got her to the couch, and she immediately curled into herself, keening that terrible sound. "What do I do? Inge, what do I? Nothing," she gasped. "Can't stop it." Her back arched. The scream rose to a pitch that made his ears ring. And then, with a sound like a water balloon bursting in slow motion, something emerged. Marcus stumbled backward, his taxonomist brain trying desperately to categorize what he was seeing and failing spectacularly. It was roughly the size of a watermelon, translucent, gleaming wetly in the morning light streaming through the windows. Clear goo, but not quite there, were structures inside it, geometries that shifted and rotated, patterns that his eyes couldn't quite hold on to. And it was breathing. He could see it contracting and expanding, pulling in. The surface rippled with what might have been cilia, or might have been tiny hands, or might have been something his brain had no reference for. Inge lay on the couch, still, her chest no longer rising. "No," Marcus said. "No, no." He checked for a pulse. Nothing. Her skin was already cooling, the fever heat draining away like water from a broken glass. Her eyes stared at nothing, and around her neck, he noticed for the first time, hung an amulet he'd never seen her wear, a small silver thing, tarnished black, inscribed with symbols that matched the cracks in his workshop floor. The glob made a sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a purr. Something between curiosity and hunger. Marcus sat down hard on the floor, his back against the wall, and stared at the two impossible things in his cabin. A dead woman who'd been too old to give birth, and a translucent blob of sentient goo that shouldn't exist in any taxonomic classification he'd ever studied. "Okay," he said to the empty room. "Okay. This is fine. This is a totally normal Tuesday." The glob rippled in response, and one of the internal geometries rotated in a way that Marcus's hindbrain interpreted as *attention*. It was looking at him. Or whatever passed for looking when you were a glob of clear goo with no discernible eyes. "Right," Marcus continued, because talking to impossible things had become his primary coping mechanism. "So, you're alive. She's dead. I have no truck, no way to get help, and I'm 400 miles from the nearest person who might believe any of this, assuming I haven't completely lost my mind from 7 years of hallucinogenic mushroom tea." The glob quivered. One of its internal structures extended toward him, not threatening, just reaching. Like a child reaching for a parent. "Oh no," Marcus said. "Absolutely not. I am not responsible for you. I don't even know what you are." The reaching intensified. The glob made that sound again, more insistent. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to think. Inge was dead. He needed to... What? Bury her? Call someone? He had no phone service out here. That had been part of the point. Her truck was in the clearing, but she'd said his truck needed repairs, and he had no idea what repairs, or if he could even knock at the door. Marcus's eyes snapped open. He hadn't heard anyone approach. Hadn't heard a vehicle. The glob had gone very still, all its internal geometries aligned in what read distinctly as wariness. Another knock. 3 precise taps. Marcus stood slowly, moved to the door, opened it a crack. The ninnies stood on his porch. All 6 of them, had there been 6 before. He couldn't remember ranged in a semicircle, wearing their ridiculous hats and their simpering expressions. But their eyes, he noticed, were sharp, alert. Nothing simpering about the intelligence behind them. Marcus Wendell, the front ninny, said, in a voice that was surprisingly normal, almost bureaucratic, "We've come to help with your situation." "My situation," Marcus repeated flatly. "The coitus," another ninny clarified, gesturing vaguely. "The procreative act between dimensional boundaries. It's always messy. That's why we're here." "I didn't, she didn't, we never," Marcus sputtered. "Not that kind of coitus," the first ninny said, with exaggerated patience. "The merging. The boundary dissolution. Inge has been pregnant with that," it gestured toward the glob, "for 7 years. Ever since she touched the amulet she took from the underground. It's been growing inside her in the spaces between thoughts, feeding on the mushroom spores, the reality distortions, the accumulated strangeness of this place. And now it's born, and she's gone, and you've got a mess to clean up." "Literally," another ninny added, peering past Marcus into the cabin. "Is that backstrap? On her coat?" "No. Wait, that's just the couch leather." "Never mind." Marcus felt his grip on sanity, already tenuous, start to slip entirely. "Who are you people?" "We're the ninnies," they said in unison, as if that explained everything. Then, the first one added, "We're what happens when Little Red Riding Hood goes into the woods and never comes back out. We're the helpers, the witnesses, the ones who know how. Dispose of bodies and care for impossible offspring, and explain to traumatized taxonomists that sometimes the drugs wear off and things get more strange. Not less." "I don't will help," the ninny interrupted. "But you have to do something for us in return. Of course there's a catch. Take the glob with you when you leave. Take it to civilization. Let it see the world. It's important. We can't explain why. Not yet. But it's why Inge did all of this. Why she prepared you. The glob needs a taxonomist. Someone to teach it categories, boundaries. What's real and what's real in a different way." Marcus looked back at the glob, which had started to move across the floor toward him with a rolling, undulating motion that was somehow both disgusting and endearing. The internal geometries were rotating faster now, and he could absolutely swear that they were forming shapes. Letters. The same letters from his workshop floor. "It's trying to communicate," he breathed. "Obviously," the ninny said. "It's 3 hours old and already smarter than most graduate students. Now, are you going to let us help? Or are you going to stand here having an existential crisis while Inge decomposes on your couch?" Marcus stepped aside. The ninnies flowed into the cabin with disturbing efficiency. 3 of them went immediately to Inge's body, lifting her with a tenderness that contradicted their absurd appearance. They wrapped her in his spare blankets, speaking softly to each other in a language Marcus didn't recognize, but that sounded oddly like birdsong, mixed with distant thunder. "We'll take her to the grove," one of them told Marcus. "It's where all the boundary crossers go. She'll like it there. Plenty of other fools who thought they could control what they found in the deep places." The other 3 ninnies approached the glob, which immediately reached toward them with those internal geometric tendrils. They made cooing sounds, ridiculous baby talk, and the glob asterisk responded asterisk, rippling and pulsing in what Marcus's traumatized brain interpreted as pleasure. "You'll need to feed it," one ninny informed him. "Not food, experiences. Show it things, new things. It consumes novelty the way you consume oxygen, Starve it, and it'll start eating memories. Yours first. Then anyone nearby. Fantastic, Marcus muttered. How do I transport a glob of sentient goo? The ninny produced, from somewhere in the folds of its absurd clothing, a mason jar. A large one, the kind people used for pickling entire cucumbers. Here. It'll compress. They're very accommodating at this stage. It won't suffocate? All three ninnies laughed, that same unsettling giggle from the nightmare version of Inge's property. It doesn't breathe air, Marcus. It breathes asterisk category errors asterisk. It'll be fine in the jar, probably even comfortable. While Marcus watched in horrified fascination, the ninnies coaxed the glob into the mason jar. It went willingly, compressing itself down to fit, its internal geometries folding in ways that made Marcus's eyes water. Once inside, it pressed itself against the glass, and he could see those structures more clearly now, definitely letters, definitely writing something. He leaned closer, squinting. Asterisk, help asterisk, the letters spelled out. Asterisk, afraid asterisk. Oh, Jesus, Marcus whispered. It's scared. Of course it's scared, a ninny said gently. It's a newborn consciousness thrust into a reality it doesn't understand. Like you, really. Like all of us. The ninnies carrying Inge's body moved toward the door. The ones helping with the glob stepped back, their work apparently done. Your truck, the first ninny said, pulling a set of keys from its pocket. The repairs were done 3 weeks ago. Inge was just waiting for the right moment. The keys are under the seat. The tank's full. Drive east, not west. West leads to more strangeness. East leads to, well, not normal, but closer to it. What about? Marcus gestured vaguely at everything. The cabin, the chickens, the deer who were probably forming pentagrams in his clearing right now. Leave them. They were never yours. They were part of the preparation. Part of the becoming. The ninny moved to the door, paused. The amulet. Take it from Inge's neck before we go. You'll need it. For what? For when you come back. Because you will come back, Marcus. The underground is real. The stairs in your workshop are real. And eventually, you'll need to descend them. But first, you need to understand what the glob understands. What Inge was trying to teach you. Which is? The ninny smiled, and for just a moment, its face shifted, became something older, wiser, terribly sad. That every category is a cage, and sometimes the only way to survive is to refuse to be categorized. They left, carrying Inge's body, singing that strange birdsong thunder language. Marcus stood in his now empty cabin, holding a mason jar containing a translucent blob of impossible goo that was spelling out asterisk, hungry asterisk in its internal geometries. He went to the couch, carefully removed the amulet from Inge's neck. It was warm, warmer than it should be, and the symbols seemed to shift and crawl under his fingers. He put it in his pocket. Then he went to the workshop, grabbed the Crayola box, his notebook with all the symbol translations, and the copy of Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales. If he was leaving, and he was definitely leaving, these were coming with him. His truck was exactly where the ninny said it would be, parked behind the cabin, covered in pine needles and 7 years of neglect. But when he turned the key, it started immediately, purring like it had been running every day. Marcus set the mason jar carefully in the passenger seat. The glob pressed against the glass, watching him with whatever served as its perception. Okay, he said, adjusting the mirrors, checking the fuel gauge. Okay, we're doing this. We're driving to civilization. We're going to find someone who can explain what the hell is happening. Or going to drive until the drugs wear off, and this all makes sense. Or we're going to drive off a cliff, because I've completely lost my mind. The letters shifted. Asterisk, east, asterisk. Yeah, Marcus agreed. East, away from the strangeness. He put the truck in gear, pulled out of the clearing, and started down the overgrown road that led, eventually, to something resembling the world he used to know. The chickens watched him go with all their eyes. The deer in the clearing shifted from their current pattern, which looked disturbingly like a birthing diagram, into something that might have been a wave. In the rearview mirror, he could see the workshop, and just for a moment, he could have sworn he saw the northeastern corner glowing, pulsing, as if something down there was aware he was leaving and was not entirely pleased about it. But he kept driving. East. Toward civilization. Toward answers. Or at least toward questions that made more sense than the ones he was leaving behind. The glob settled into its jar, its internal geometry slowing their rotation into something that looked almost like contentment. Or maybe just exhaustion. Hard to tell with beings that existed between categories. Marcus drove for 3 hours before he spoke again. "I'm calling you Hugo," he told the glob. "If you're going to be my, whatever you are, you need a name, something normal, something that doesn't remind me that you were born from an 8-year-old woman who drugged me for 7 years." The glob's geometries flashed. Asterisk Hugo, acceptable asterisk. Good. Now, Hugo, let me tell you about the world we're driving toward. It's got coffee shops and traffic lights, and people who have never seen a Brussels sprout play backgammon. You're going to hate it. Asterisk hate implies category asterisk, Hugo spelled out. Asterisk, I refuse asterisk. Marcus laughed a sound that might have been hysteria, or might have been the first genuine amusement he'd felt in 7 years. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'm starting to understand that." They drove east, away from the woods and the workshop and the stairs that led down to something Marcus still didn't understand. In his pocket, the amulet pulsed with warmth, counting down to the moment inevitable. He knew now when he'd have to turn around and go back. But not today. Today he would drive towards civilization with a jar full of impossible goo and a box of Crayolas, and try to remember what it felt like to be a person who lived in a world where men didn't die giving birth to sentient category errors. He couldn't quite remember. But maybe Hugo could teach him. After all, Hugo had refused to be categorized from the moment of birth. Maybe that was the point all along. Chapter 7. The betrayal at mile 73. Alistair made it another 26 miles before the truck died again. This time there was no warning sound, no mechanical death rattle, just sudden, complete silence as the engine cut out like someone had flipped a switch. The truck coasted to a stop in the middle of the road, which had narrowed from 2 ruts to barely one. Hemmed in on both sides by pine trees so dense we seemed to be actively leaning inward. "Hugo," Alistair said tiredly, "please tell me this is natural mechanical failure." The glob's geometries rotated slowly, almost reluctantly. Asterisk no. Sabotage. Someone does not want US to reach civilization. Asterisk, fantastic. Alistair hit the steering wheel with his palm, immediately regretted it as pain shot up his arm. Who? The pepper. Something else. Asterisk, someone close. Someone who had access. Asterisk, before Alistair could process that, he heard footsteps. Not the soft pad of forest animals or the crunch of boots on pine needles, but a deliberate, rhythmic clicking like high heels on hardwood. except they were on dirt road in the middle of nowhere. The figure that emerged from the tree line made Alistair's stomach drop. It was Robert, the insurance adjuster ninny. Except he wasn't wearing his ridiculous hat anymore, and his face that perfectly normal, disappointingly ordinary face had hardened into something that looked almost reptilian in its cold calculation. "Hello, Alistair," Robert said, stopping about 20 feet from the truck. "Sorry about your engine. Well, actually, I'm not sorry at all." Alistair grabbed Hugo's jar, got out of the truck slowly. "You were at my cabin. You helped with Inge's body. I played my part beautifully, didn't I?" Robert smiled, and it wasn't the simpering ninny smile anymore. It was the smile of someone who'd been wearing a mask for years and was finally relieved to take it off. "I've been playing it for 37 years, ever since Inge found me in 1987, ever since she thought she'd recruited another lost soul for her little boundary crossing support group. You're not really a ninny." "Oh, I am. Just not asterisk her asterisk ninny." Robert reached into his jacket, a jacket Alistair definitely didn't remember him wearing before, and pulled out a piece of chalk. Ordinary white chalk, the kind teachers used on blackboards. Except this chalk was glowing faintly, pulsing with the same rhythm as the amulet in Alistair's pocket. "I work for something older than Inge's little experiment," Robert continued, beginning to draw on the dirt road. "Something that's been waiting at the bottom of those stairs for a very, very long time. Something that doesn't want to be named by a taxonomist who refuses to stay categorized." The chalk marks formed symbols, not the same ones from Alistair's workshop floor, but similar. Related, like a different dialect of the same language. As Robert drew, the air began to shimmer, and Alistair felt Hugo's jar grow warm in his hands. Asterisk danger asterisk, Hugo spelled urgently. Asterisk summoning. Run. Asterisk I can't run, Alistair hissed. "The truck's dead. We're miles from anywhere, exactly," Robert said, finishing his chalk circle. "Inge was brilliant. I'll give her that. She found you, prepared you, even gave birth to a narrative consciousness to guide you. But she made one crucial mistake. She thought she could control what you'd find down there. She thought if she made you strong enough, strange enough, you could name it and contain it. She was wrong." He stepped back from the circle, and something began to rise from it. Not physically, there was no smoke or fire or dramatic emergence, but Alistair could feel it rising, could sense something pushing through from whatever space existed beneath the chalk marks. "Some things don't want to be contained," Robert said. "Some things want to be set free. And they need someone who knows how to open doors, who's been practicing for 7 years with mushroom tea and reality distortions, who's already proven he can blur the line between what is and what should never be." "You want me to go down the stairs," Alistair said slowly. "But not to name what's there, to release it. Very good. See, you're learning." Robert's smile widened. "And to make sure you cooperate." The thing finished rising. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, and unmistakably vegetable. An ochre stalk, Alistair's traumatized taxonomist brain identified. Except, this ochre was wrong in every way that mattered. Its surface was covered in spines that wept something that looked like oil, smelled like regret. Its pod-like head split open to reveal rows of what might have been teeth or might have been tiny, screaming faces. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of things rotting in dark places, of composting memories, of mulch and malice. "Alistair Stone." It hissed. "The thief." "The namer." The fool who thinks he can run. Hugo's geometries went wild, flashing words faster than Alistair could read them. But the message was clear. Asterisk ancient. Dangerous. Bellow dweller. Cannot fight. Asterisk I don't suppose we can talk about this, Alistair said, backing toward the truck. The ochre laughed, a sound like vegetables dying in frost. You will return to your cabin. You will descend the stairs. You will speak the name that opens the final door. And if you refuse, it moved forward with horrifying speed, one thorny appendage lashing out. Alistair Dove, roll, came up with Hugo's jar somehow still intact. The ochre strike hit the truck instead, and Alistair heard the shriek of metal tearing. When he looked back, there was a hole in the hood the size of a basketball, edges smoking. Okay, Alistair panted. Okay, not talking then. He ran. Into the forest, away from the road, branches whipping his face. Behind him, he could hear the ochre giving chase. Moving through the undergrowth with the efficiency of something that was part plant, part nightmare, and entirely determined. Hugo bounced in his grip, geometry spinning. Asterisk left. Water. 20 yards. Asterisk Alistair veered left, crashed through a thicket, and emerged onto the bank of a narrow stream. The water was dark, fast-moving, and very clearly not deep enough to stop a 7-foot ochre monster. Hugo, I'm open to suggestions. Asterisk amulet. Use amulet. Draw with IT asterisk. Draw what? Asterisk anything. Categories are weapons. Name IT. Asterisk Alistair fumbled in his pocket, pulled out the amulet. It was hot now, almost burning, and when he held it up, he could see that the symbols on its surface were glowing the same way Robert's chalk had glowed. The ochre burst through the trees behind him, thorns extended, podmouth open wide enough to swallow Alistair's head. Alistair dropped to his knees and drew. He didn't know what he was drawing. His hand moved on its own. Guided by the amulet, or by Hugo, or by 7 years of living in a place where reality was negotiable, he drew categories, boundaries, the line between plant and animal, between vegetable and monster, between what should exist and what absolutely shouldn't. The ochre struck and stopped. It hovered inches from Alistair's face, thorns trembling, frozen in mid-attack. The symbols he'd drawn in the dirt with the amulet were glowing now, bright enough to hurt his eyes, and the ochre was caught in them, trapped in the boundaries he'd defined. You cannot, it gasped, its voice losing that rotting mulch quality, becoming smaller. You cannot categorize me. I am older than you're a vegetable, Alistair said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Abel Moscius esculentus, native to Africa, cultivated for 3,000 years. You have a taxonomic classification. You have a place in the natural order. And that place is not here, threatening me with your weird thorn things. The ochre screamed a sound that made Alistair's teeth ache and probably traumatized every chipmunk within 100 yards. It began to shrink, to compress, to fold in on itself as the category Alistair had drawn tightened around it. You think this changes anything? It snarled as it diminished. You think defeating one guardian means you're safe? Robert has already sabotaged your truck. He's already sent word back to the grove. They're coming for you, Alistair. All of them. Every vegetable, every boundary dweller, everything that Inge thought she'd recruited to her cause, but that was really serving something older. Wait all the ninnies. Not all. The ochre was barely 3 feet tall now, still shrinking. Millicent is still loyal. Maybe 1 or 2 others. But most of us? We were always moles. always waiting for Inge to prepare someone capable enough to open the final door. Someone like you. It collapsed into nothing, not death, Alistair sensed, but banishment, sent back to wherever Robert's chalk circle had summoned it from. Alistair stood there, breathing hard, the amulet cooling in his hand. Hugo's geometries had slowed to a steady, contemplative pulse. "We need to go back," Alistair said. "Don't we?" Asterisk, yes asterisk, Hugo spelled. Asterisk cannot run from story, can only choose how story ends. Asterisk, and if I go back, if I descend the stairs, I might open the final door. I might release whatever Robert and his faction want released. Asterisk, or you might name IT, contain IT. Prevent IT, asterisk, no pressure then. Asterisk story is always pressure. Asterisk Alistair looked back toward the road, where Robert was presumably still waiting, probably with more chalk symbols and more creatures to summon. Going back that way was suicide, but the forest stretched in every direction, and he was holding a mason jar containing a sentient narrative consciousness. Wearing an amulet that could draw boundaries in reality, carrying a box of Crayolas that had saved him once already. He heard something, then a sound, cutting through the forest silence, a splash, rhythmic and purposeful. Coming from upstream. Alistair moved toward it cautiously. Hugo held close. The stream widened ahead, opening into a small pool, and there, tied to a half-submerged log, was a small boat. In the boat, gleaming in the late afternoon light, was a harpoon. Not a fishing harpoon. A real harpoon, the kind used for whaling, with a rope coiled beside it and a note pinned to the shaft with what looked like a thorn. Alistair pulled the note free, read it in the fading light. Asterisk, Alistairisk, asterisk Robert is compromised. Has been for years. Trust only Millicent. The harpoon will protect you from what swims in the deep streams. Follow the water east, it flows towards civilization. But it flows through territory Robert doesn't control. He'll pursue, but not by water. He's afraid of it. Asterisk, asterisk, the final door can only be opened from below. But it can only be closed from above. You need to be both places at once. That's what Hugo is for. That's what we've all been for. Asterisk, asterisk, I'm sorry I can't be there. I'm sorry I have to stay here and deal with the other compromised ninnies. I'm sorry Inge died before she could explain everything. But you're ready. Alistair, you've been ready since the moment you stole that Rothko, since the moment you chose beauty over belonging. Asterisk, asterisk, Godspeed. Asterisk, asterisk, Cam, asterisk, Alistair looked at the boat, at the harpoon, at Hugo glowing softly in his jar. She knew, he said quietly. Millicent knew Robert was compromised. She probably knew before today. And she left this here how long ago? How many steps ahead is she planning? Asterisk ninnies exist outside linear time asterisk, Hugo spelled. Asterisk Millicent placed boat here yesterday and 3 years ago. Both true. Asterisk I hate temporal paradoxes. Asterisk irrelevant. Must choose, boat or road. Asterisk Alistair climbed into the boat. It was old but solid, and when he set Hugo down and picked up the harpoon, it felt perfectly weighted in his hands, like it had been made for him specifically. The rope was tied to the boat in a complex knot he didn't recognize, but that his fingers somehow knew how to undo. He pushed off from the log, and the current caught him immediately, pulling him downstream, no, upstream. The water was flowing in both directions at once, or possibly in no direction, or possibly in a direction that only made sense from outside the stream. Hugo, Alistair said, as they floated through the twilight forest, "Are we still in the normal world? Asterisk were we ever? Asterisk a fair point." Behind them, distantly, Alistair heard Robert shouting. Heard other voices joining his too, maybe 3 other ninnies, revealed as moles, as agents of whatever waited at the bottom of the stairs. They were crashing through the forest, following the sound of the water, and Alistair knew they'd reach the stream eventually. But for now, he was moving. East, toward civilization, or toward whatever counted as civilization, in a world where insurance adjusters summoned vegetable monsters and old women gave birth to sentient stories. The harpoon lay across his knees. The amulet pulsed in his pocket in rhythm with the current. The Crayolas hummed from the backpack he'd grabbed from the truck before fleeing into the forest. And in the mason jar between his feet, Hugo spelled out words that might have been comfort or might have been prophecy. Asterisk every story needs betrayal. Needed Robert to reveal himself. Needed to know who serves what. Now we know. Now we can choose. Asterisk choose what? Asterisk whether to name the thing below. Or become IT. Asterisk Alistair didn't answer. He just held the harpoon and watched the forest slide past and tried not to think about the fact that he was floating down a stream that flowed in impossible directions, pursued by compromised ninnies, carrying a narrative consciousness in a jar, heading toward either salvation or doom. The boat rounded a bend, and the forest opened up ahead into something that might have been a lake, or might have been something much stranger. And in the water, just beneath the surface, Alistair saw shapes moving. Large shapes. Shapes that suggested the harpoon might not be decorative after all. "Hugo," he said quietly, "what swims in the deep streams?" Hugo's geometries flickered, hesitated, then spelled out 2 words that made Alistair's blood run cold. Asterisk unfinished stories. Asterisk the shapes rose toward the surface, and Alistair gripped the harpoon tighter, and the boat carried them forward into the deepening dark.